Taxi driver refuses Messi a ride. What Messi does next goes viral. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. In the heart of a bustling city, Carlos, a taxi driver, waited for his next passenger. He prided himself on choosing his riders carefully, preferring well-dressed, important-looking customers over those he assumed couldn't afford his fare. One evening, a man in casual clothes, a simple hoodie and sneakers, approached Carlos's taxi. He raised a hand, signaling for a ride. But Carlos barely glanced at him before shaking his head dismissively. "Not my problem," Carlos muttered, looking past the man for a more valuable passenger. The man, calm and unfazed, simply nodded and walked away. He didn't argue, didn't demand respect, he just stepped aside. What Carlos didn't realize was that he had just refused a ride to Lionel Messi, one of the greatest footballers of all time. Moments later, another taxi screeched to a stop. The driver, wide-eyed and excited, jumped out and personally opened the door for Messi. "Senor Messi, please, ride with me. It's an honor." As Messi climbed in, the moment was caught on camera by onlookers who recognized him. The video immediately went viral, showing how one taxi driver dismissed him, while another treated him with respect. Carlos's night continued as usual. He picked up a few businessmen from a high-end restaurant, drove a well-dressed couple to the theater, and ferried some tourists back to their luxury hotel. By his standards, it was a good evening, full of the kinds of passengers he preferred. As he drove, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction. His strategy of selectively choosing riders had served him well over the years. Why waste time on those who likely couldn't afford a decent tip? Little did he know that his actions that evening were about to catch up with him in a big way. Meanwhile, across town, the story of Messi's taxi ride was spreading like wildfire. Social media was abuzz with the video of the humble star being turned away by one driver and warmly welcomed by another. People were quick to praise the kind driver, whose name was soon revealed to be Diego. Overnight, he became a local hero, the embodiment of the respect and decency that Messi deserved. On the other hand, Carlos, though not yet named, was already being vilified. Comments poured in, condemning the arrogant and judgmental driver who had the audacity to refuse Messi. As the night wore on, the story only gained traction. News outlets picked it up, celebrities shared it, and soon, it had become a global talking point. And through it all, Messi remained characteristically humble. When asked about the incident, he simply smiled and said, "It's no big deal. These things happen. I'm just grateful for the kindness of the driver who did pick me up." But for Carlos, oblivious to the growing storm, the real consequences were yet to come. The next morning, Carlos woke up to find his taxi company trending online, but not in a good way. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages, and when he checked the news, his heart dropped. The story had exploded, with thousands of people criticizing his actions. "Who does this taxi driver think he is?" read one comment. "The arrogance. To think he's too good for Messi," said another. Carlos was stunned. He had no idea the man he dismissed was Messi. But that hardly seemed to matter to the angry masses online. His boss, the owner of the taxi company, was furious. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he yelled over the phone. "You've brought shame to our entire company." Carlos tried to explain, to defend himself, but it was no use. The damage was done. Meanwhile, Diego, the driver who had given Messi a ride, was experiencing a very different kind of attention. His small taxi service was suddenly inundated with calls and requests. People wanted to ride with him, to meet the man who had treated Messi with such kindness. Journalists sought him out for interviews. Local businesses offered him sponsorships. Overnight, Diego had become a celebrity in his own right. And through it all, he remained humble, echoing Messi's own words. "I didn't do anything special," he insisted. "I just treated him like I would any other passenger. With respect." Back at Carlos's taxi stand, things were grim. Customers were canceling rides, choosing other companies. Some even came by just to hurl insults at Carlos. He was learning, in the harshest way possible, the true cost of his prejudice. As the days went by, the story refused to die down. Messi's humble response only fueled the public's admiration for him and their disdain for Carlos. Carlos's taxi sat idle for hours. No one wanted to ride with the Messi snubber, as he had been dubbed by the media. Desperate, Carlos tried to apologize. He issued a public statement, expressing his regret and asking for forgiveness. But it rang hollow to many. After all, he wasn't apologizing for his prejudice, but for the consequences of getting caught. Meanwhile, Diego's star continued to rise. He was invited to speak at schools, to share his story and the importance of treating everyone with respect. "You never know who you might be helping," he would say. "Every person deserves kindness, no matter what they look like or what they're wearing." His message resonated with people around the world. In a society often obsessed with status and appearance, Diego's actions were a reminder of what truly mattered. Even Messi himself was touched. He reached out to Diego, thanking him personally for his kindness. "In a world where people are often judged by their appearance," Messi said, "it's refreshing to meet someone who looks beyond that. You're an inspiration, Diego." As for Carlos, he was learning a hard lesson. His once thriving taxi business was on the brink of collapse. He had always thought his strategy of selective service was smart. But now, faced with the consequences, he was starting to realize how misguided it had been. Slowly, painfully, Carlos was beginning to understand that true success isn't about catering to the wealthy or the well-dressed. It's about treating everyone, regardless of their appearance, with dignity and respect. It was a harsh lesson, but one that would change the course of his life. A month had passed since the incident, and Carlos's life had changed drastically. His taxi business had dwindled to almost nothing. He spent most days sitting in his cab, waiting for riders who never came. The shame and regret were constant companions. He replayed that fateful moment over and over in his mind, the casual flick of his hand, the dismissive words. If only he could go back, do things differently. But amidst the darkness, there was a glimmer of hope. Carlos had begun to realize that this crisis was also an opportunity, a chance to rebuild his life on a new foundation. He started small. Each morning, he would set out in his taxi, but instead of cruising the wealthy neighborhoods, he drove through the areas he had once avoided. He began to see the city through new eyes. Where once he saw only poverty and inconvenience, he now saw community and resilience. Slowly, tentatively, he started picking up passengers from these neighborhoods. At first, they were wary, recognizing him from the news. But Carlos was determined to show them a different side of himself. He greeted each rider with a smile and a kind word. He listened to their stories, learned about their lives. And bit by bit, he began to earn their trust. One day, he picked up an elderly woman carrying heavy grocery bags. In the past, he would have driven right by her. But now, he pulled over and hopped out to help her with her bags. As he drove her home, she told him about her life, about the children she had raised on her own, about the struggles she had faced. And for the first time, Carlos truly listened. When he dropped her off, she squeezed his hand and thanked him. "You're a good man," she said. "Don't let anyone tell you different." Those words stayed with Carlos. They gave him strength as he continued on his path of redemption. As Carlos's new approach to his work began to take hold, something unexpected happened. People started to take notice, not just of his change in attitude, but of his story. It started with a local blogger who had been following the Messi incident. She wrote a piece about Carlos's efforts to turn his life around, to learn from his mistakes. The article went viral. People who had once condemned Carlos now applauded his growth. They saw in him a reflection of their own struggles and aspirations. Soon, other media outlets picked up the story. They interviewed Carlos, giving him a platform to share his journey. "I thought I had it all figured out," he would say. "I thought success was about catering to a certain type of customer. But I was wrong." Success is about treating everyone with respect, regardless of who they are or what they look like. His words resonated with people around the world. In a society often divided by class and status, Carlos's story was a reminder of our shared humanity. Even Diego, the driver who had once been celebrated as Carlos's foil, reached out to him. "I'm proud of you," he said. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, and even more to change." The two men met for coffee, sharing their experiences. They discovered they had more in common than they had once thought: a love for their city, a desire to make a difference. Together, they hatched a plan. They would start a new kind of taxi service, one that prioritized service and respect over status and appearance. They pooled their resources, bought a small fleet of cars, and hired a team of drivers who shared their values. And so, the People's Taxi was born. It was a service for everyone, regardless of their background or means. Carlos and Diego became partners, both in business and in their mission to spread a message of unity and compassion. A year had passed since the launch of the People's Taxi, and the company was thriving. Carlos and Diego had become well-known figures in the city, not just for their business success, but for their commitment to social good. They used a portion of their profits to support local charities and community projects. They offered free rides to job interviews for the unemployed. They became a symbol of what a socially conscious business could achieve. But their influence extended beyond their immediate community. Their story had caught the attention of people around the world, including some very influential figures. One day, they received a call from a representative of the United Nations. The UN was launching a global initiative to promote equality and inclusion, and they wanted Carlos and Diego to be ambassadors. It was a humbling moment for the two men. They had started with a simple idea: to treat everyone with respect. And now, that idea was resonating on a global scale. They accepted the invitation, and soon found themselves traveling the world, sharing their story and their vision. They spoke at conferences and schools, met with business leaders and policymakers. Everywhere they went, they spread the message that had come to define their lives: that every person, no matter their station in life, deserves to be treated with dignity. And people listened. Inspired by Carlos and Diego's example, other businesses began to adopt their model. The People's Taxi became not just a company, but a movement. Back home, their original taxi company was thriving too. The drivers who had once shunned Carlos now looked up to him as a leader and a mentor. Carlos never forgot the lesson he had learned from Lionel Messi, that true greatness is defined by humility and kindness. He made sure to instill those values in every driver who worked for him. And so, what had started as a moment of prejudice and shame had become a catalyst for profound change. Carlos and Diego had shown that it's never too late to learn, to grow, and to make a difference. 5 years had passed, and the People's Taxi had become a household name. Carlos and Diego's face smiled from billboards and magazine covers, symbols of a new kind of business leadership. But for all their success, the two men never lost sight of what mattered most: the people they served. Every year, on the anniversary of that fateful night when Carlos had refused Messi's fare, they would host a special event. They called it Kindness Day. On Kindness Day, all rides were free. But there was a catch: each passenger had to pledge to perform an act of kindness for someone else. It was a simple idea, but a powerful one. By turning passengers into participants, Carlos and Diego were spreading the spirit of compassion far beyond the confines of their taxis. Stories would pour in from all over the city, of strangers helping strangers, of long-divided neighbors finally coming together. For one day a year, the city was transformed into a community in the truest sense of the word. And at the heart of it all were Carlos and Diego, the unlikely duo who had proven that change is always possible, that it's never too late to choose kindness. As the years went by, their impact only grew. They expanded their business to other cities, then other countries. They became not just business leaders, but global advocates for social change. And through it all, they never forgot the man who had inspired them, Lionel Messi. They often told the story of that night, not as a moment of shame, but as a turning point. a reminder that even the smallest actions can have profound consequences. Messi himself had become a supporter of their cause. He would often speak of them in interviews, praising their work and their vision. "What Carlos and Diego have achieved," he once said, "is a testament to the power of the human spirit. They have shown us that it's not about perfection, but about the willingness to learn and grow. They are true champions, on and off the field." For Carlos and Diego, those words were the highest praise imaginable. Because they knew, deep down, that their greatest achievement wasn't their business success or their global influence. It was the countless lives they had touched, the hearts they had opened, the minds they had changed. It was the proof that, in a world often divided by difference, kindness is the great unifier. And so, as they looked to the future, Carlos and Diego knew that their work was far from over. There were always more hearts to touch, more bridges to build. But they faced that future with hope and determination, knowing that they had already made an indelible mark. They had shown the world the true meaning of greatness, and it had nothing to do with fame or fortune. It was about the simple, profound, transformative power of human kindness. That was the lesson of the people's taxi. And it was a lesson they would spend the rest of their lives sharing. A decade had passed since that fateful night, and the world had changed in ways that once seemed unimaginable. The people's taxi had become a global phenomenon, a symbol of a new era of business, one driven not just by profit, but by purpose. Carlos and Diego, now in their 60s, had become elder statesmen of this new world. They were invited to speak at the United Nations, to advise heads of state and captains of industry. But for all the accolades and influence, they never lost touch with their roots. They still spent time behind the wheel, talking with passengers, listening to their stories. It was on one such ride that they received a surprise visit from an old friend. Lionel Messi, now retired from football but no less a global icon, slid into the back seat of their taxi. "I hope this ride is on the house," he joked, his eyes sparkling with mirth. Carlos and Diego could hardly believe it. The man who had inadvertently started it all, here in their cab, after all these years. As they drove, they reminisced about old times, about the twists and turns that had brought them to this moment. Messi listened intently, his admiration for the two men growing with every word. "You know," he said finally, "I've been thinking a lot about legacy lately. About what we leave behind." Carlos and Diego nodded, understanding. It was a thought that often weighed on their own minds. "And I've come to realize," Messi continued, "that the greatest legacy isn't in the trophies or the records. It's in the impact we have on others. The way we change lives, inspire dreams." He looked at Carlos and Diego, his eyes shining with emotion. "And by that measure," he said, "you two are the greatest of all time. What you've built, what you've achieved, it's a legacy that will endure long after all of us are gone." Carlos and Diego were speechless. To hear such words from Messi, a man they had long admired, it was overwhelming. But more than that, it was a validation. A confirmation that they had chosen the right path, that their work had mattered. As they dropped Messi off at his destination, he turned to them one last time. "Keep doing what you're doing," he said. "The world needs more people like you." And with that, he was gone. But his words lingered, a reminder of the incredible journey that had brought them here. As they drove away, Carlos and Diego looked at each other, their eyes misty with emotion. "We did it," Carlos said softly. "We really did it." Diego nodded, his hand finding Carlos's and squeezing it tight. "No, we did it," he said. "Together." And that, in the end, was the true lesson of their story. That greatness is not a solo pursuit, but a shared one. That when we lift each other up, when we choose compassion over judgment, there is no limit to what we can achieve. As they drove off into the city, the sun setting behind them, Carlos and Diego knew that their journey was far from over. There were always more people to help, more hearts to touch. But they faced that future together, united by a bond that had been forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. A bond of respect, of understanding, of shared humanity. It was the bond that had transformed a moment of prejudice into a movement of kindness. And it was a bond that would endure, as long as there were people willing to open their hearts and see the best in one another. For in the end, that's what the People's Taxi had always been about. Not just a business, but a belief. A belief in the transformative power of human connection. A belief that, in a world often divided, kindness is the great unifier. And a belief that, no matter where we come from or what we look like, we all share the same fundamental desire. To be seen, to be heard, to be valued. To be treated, in the words of a humble taxi driver and a legendary footballer, with the respect and dignity we all deserve. That was the legacy of Carlos and Diego. And it was a legacy that would endure, as long as there were people willing to carry it forward. As long as there were people willing to choose, in the face of judgment and division, the simple power of kindness. For in that choice, as Carlos and Diego had learned, lies the true measure of greatness. Not in the accolades or the achievements, but in the lives we touch, the hearts we open, the dreams we inspire. In the end, that's what matters most. And that's the lesson that the People's Taxi will carry forward to generations yet to come. A simple lesson, but a profound one. A lesson of hope, of compassion, of the boundless potential of the human spirit. A lesson that began with a chance encounter and ended with a world transformed. The lesson of Carlos and Diego. The lesson of the People's Taxi.